Welcome to the haunting mystery of the Rocky Mountains. Let me take a deep breath before ushering you into the haunting, almost supernatural story that has puzzled, thrilled, and terrified outdoor enthusiasts across America for decades. The Rocky Mountains, colloquially known as the Rockies, have always stood as both the pride and the peril of North American wilderness. This immense range stretches over 3,000 miles from the northernmost reaches of British Columbia in Canada, slicing straight through the heart of the United States, all the way down to New Mexico. Its snow-capped spires, rugged cliffs, and labyrinthine forests have inspired not only explorers and climbers, but also artists, filmmakers, and countless campfire storytellers. But behind their breathtaking beauty, the Rockies have long been shrouded in legend and mystery. Indigenous peoples spoke in hushed tones of sacred places hidden among the peaks, and early settlers soon told tales of those who ventured into the high country only to never return. This is a land where avalanches can thunder down without warning, where storms can turn daylight into dusk within minutes, and where the silence itself can feel overwhelming, almost as if the mountains are holding their secrets tight. Through generations, the Rockies have witnessed thousands of expeditions, some triumphant, others tragic. Forest rangers talk warily of regions where compasses spin wild and unexplained lights hover at night. Hikers pass makeshift memorials to those who vanished into the frost-bitten air. Search and rescue teams still exchange stories over coffee about the hikers who slipped through their fingers like early morning mist, lost to the wilderness as if consumed by the mountains themselves. Yet, this mystery isn't contained to mere rumor and fireside fright. A single notorious event from the deep snows of the early 1980s haunts local lore more than any other. This is the incident we're about to explore, a case that turned the eyes of America and the world to the Rockies, and invited both professional investigators and amateur sleuths to try and untangle what really happened on that frozen, moonless night. You won't just hear the facts. I'll walk you through the anticipation and excitement the group felt as their journey began, the bone-chilling terror as their plans unraveled, and the endless questions that still lurk like shadows at the edge of every forest trail. The deeper you go, the more you may find that the largest mysteries aren't hidden in geography or science, but in humanity's enduring fascination with the unknown. So get comfortable, whether you're nestled in a warm living room or sitting by a campfire at the base of a mountain. Together we're about to pull back the veil on the Rockies' most mystifying legend. The Rocky Mountains, the ultimate proving ground for dreamers. The Rocky Mountains, or the Rockies as they're lovingly called, are not just a breathtaking stretch of peaks and valleys, they are the enduring symbol of the American spirit of adventure. Spanning more than 3,000 miles from the remote wilds of British Columbia, Canada, all the way down to the arid lands of New Mexico, the Rockies carve a formidable boundary through the very heart of the continent. With countless jagged ridges, snow-buried slopes, and ancient forests that seem to whisper with the wind, the range has always beckoned to those restless souls hungry for challenge and meaning beyond the horizon of everyday life. For as long as people have recorded history here, the Rockies have acted as both barrier and invitation. Centuries before westward expansion, Native American peoples treated these lands with reverence, speaking of sacred peaks and the secrets of the valleys in stories passed down from one generation to the next. With the surge of pioneers during the age of manifest destiny, the mountains transformed from objects of awe and myth into black marks of peril on the crude maps of explorers. For every wagon train that found passage, there are countless stories, some true, some embellished, of travelers turned back or lost to the brutal whims of weather and land. Yet it's precisely this high-stakes gamble with the unknown that has kept the Rockies woven into the cultural fabric of America's dreamers. Decade after decade, the mountains have been a magnet for mountaineers, scientists, artists, and seekers of solitude. Reaching heights above 14,000 feet in some ranges, the Rockies promise more than just scenic grandeur. They test the limits of the body and the resiliency of the mind. Fierce blizzards can appear in an instant, burying even the most confident expedition under feet of cold silence. Avalanches, wild animals, and sudden storms all wait quietly for those who dare to disturb the calm. But for many, that's exactly the point. To stand on a windblown summit and see the world spread out in untouched magnificence is to touch something eternal. Maybe that's why the Rockies have produced such a unique subculture, one where obsession with preparation and respect for nature's unpredictability are almost holy virtues. Rescue teams, search and rescue dogs, rangers, backcountry guides, all have their own tales, their own superstitions and traditions, born from years of both success and heartbreak. In the modern era, high schoolers with nothing but dreams and battered gear, seasoned alpinists with decades of experience, and scientists chasing rare flora and fauna continue to pour into these wildernesses. Weekend warriors seek triumph, families go searching for connection, writers chase inspiration. The Rockies harden those who traverse them, no matter their original intent. It's no exaggeration to call these mountains the ultimate proving ground for anyone who believes that life is more than safe routines, that adventure, discovery, and even loss are a necessary part of what it means to truly live, which perhaps is what draws people in time and again, even when the headlines warn of disappearances or tragedies. Each new journey here is not just a trek through rock and snow, but a personal confrontation with mortality and possibility at the edge of the American dream. The main character and his band of kindred spirits. Let's dive into the heart of this story by shining a light on the cast of dreamers who would, for better or worse, be forever woven into the folklore of the Rockies. Our protagonist, Jonathan John Carter, is a 24-year-old electrical engineering student at the University of Colorado Boulder, a restless spirit, curious by nature, and famously gifted with his hands. Since high school, John's weekends weren't spent at parties but soldering circuits, tinkering with radios, and, just as passionately, testing his resolve against the unpredictable moods of the wilderness. The Rocky Mountains had always beckoned him, and by the time his senior year rolled around, he'd already summited several peaks from the Front Range to the Sawatch. This wasn't bravado, it was devotion, and John's survival instincts were the stuff of campus legend. John wasn't alone on this journey. His closest friends were an eclectic but tight-knit group, each with their own quirks and strengths. There was Marcus Hill, the resident poet and amateur photographer, whose battered old camera would come to capture some of the last moments of their adventure. Sarah Kim, a biology student and certified wilderness first responder, brought level-headed calm to crisis and encyclopedic knowledge of every plant or critter they might encounter along the trail. Rebecca "Becky" Alvarez, med student and tireless organizer, managed supplies like a pro and could whip up a trail meal that tasted like it belonged in a city bistro. Tyler Moreno, the quiet philosopher of the group, could always be counted on for midnight debates on the meaning of risk and reward around a campfire. And rounding out their roster, Alex A.J. Jackson, John's roommate, mechanical engineering major, and renowned gearhead, someone who could repair a snow-crunched tent pole with duct tape and a smile. Chloe Brooks, environmental science enthusiast, specialized in navigation. She claimed to talk to the trees to keep the group on course, much to everyone's amusement and, occasionally, appreciation. The remaining three, Chris Patel, Olivia Reynolds, and Jackson Lee, each had their own specialties, from advanced climbing techniques to journaling every twist of the journey. These 10, all members of the University of Colorado's legendary Mountaineering Society, shared not only a passion for adventure, but a code of trust rooted in countless day hikes, survival drills, and chilly pre-dawn training climbs. For months they mapped out every leg of their impending winter ascent of Thunder Peak, a notorious windswept summit deep in the Colorado Rockies, and rehearsed what-ifs down to the last energy bar. Every student in this collective had received national certifications in backcountry survival and mountaineering skills, having proven themselves on expeditions that tested their limits both physically and mentally. Together, they would face the kind of challenges that could draw out the best or the worst in any person. No one yet suspected that their bond would soon be placed under extraordinary strain, nor did they imagine that this single journey, which began as another tick on their bucket list, would become the focus of fevered investigation, speculation, and sorrow for decades to come. But if you ask anyone who knew them, they would say the same thing. These were not reckless thrill-seekers. They were planners, students of the wild, and friends who believed that the only true failure was to be afraid of living boldly. The preordained journey, winter of challenge. There's a special electricity that crackles through the air just before a great adventure. As the calendar crept into January, the bone-deep chill of winter had long claimed the Rocky Mountains. It was a time when most sane folks preferred their fireplaces or cozy diners on Main Street. But for our group, this was precisely the moment when the Rockies were at their wild, uncompromising best, and thus, most irresistible to those who crave true, unmediated challenge. The plan was as bold as it was rigorous. to attempt a winter ascent of Thunder Peak, a towering summit deep within Colorado's unforgiving high country, notorious for its tempestuous winds, near-constant snowfields and treacherous alpine passes. At a daunting 12,800 feet, Thunder Peak was no Everest, but what it lacked in altitude, it made up for with unpredictability and a reputation as a heartless judge of preparedness. The peak earned its name from the storms that would roll in, seemingly out of nowhere, building up enough raw energy to make the whole mountain rumble like an angry beast. Months before their boots would ever touch the snow, the team meticulously researched topographical maps, scoured weather records from previous decades, and combed every hiking forum and rescue report available. They pored over gear catalogs and survival guides. Trekking in midwinter through Colorado's backcountry meant additional hazards. Blizzards, avalanches, hypothermia, and the ever-present risk of becoming disoriented when the world is reduced to nothing but shifting shades of white. To complicate the task, the university's Mountaineering Society required a detailed proposal before granting their blessing. The group responded with a plan worthy of professional guides. Their route would begin near the small mountain town of Aspen Creek, fictional name inspired by real Colorado towns, tracing the frozen course of Willow River before beginning their steep ascent past Timberline. They calculated everything down to the hour: food caches in the lower valleys, designated emergency rendezvous points, contingency communications with the nearest search and rescue outposts. They prepared for 20 days on the mountain. If they succeeded, their feat would earn them the national certification for expert-level alpinism, a badge worn with pride by only the most dedicated climbers in the country. Preparation was more than just planning and training. As the departure day loomed, the group gathered in chilly student lounges and at late-night planning sessions, checking and double-checking inventory, sleeping bags rated for Arctic conditions, sturdy crampons, avalanche beacons, radios, sat phones, and the kind of home-cooked trail mix that tastes infinitely better at 10,000 feet. Every packing list was obsessively cross-checked, because in the Rockies, one mistake could mean the difference between triumph and tragedy. The night before their departure, a sense of nervous excitement gripped them all. Parents called with last-minute advice or tearful encouragement. The university press snapped a group photo on campus as snowflakes drifted down in lazy spirals, the team's faces a blend of anticipation and youthful bravado. For most, it was not their first backcountry excursion, but all knew it would be the biggest. The promise and peril of the Rockies in winter, an ultimate crucible, awaited. The first days, optimism and boundless energy. The first leg of any grand adventure always seems imbued with an exhilarating mix of possibility and camaraderie, and for John Carter and his group, that spirit was palpable from the moment they boarded the early morning train out of Denver. It was mid-January, a time when most students would be tucked safely indoors with coffee and textbooks, but this crew buzzed as if the icy Colorado air were oxygen for their souls. Laughter echoed across the station platform, snowflakes swirling in the frosty light, backpacks crammed with meticulously sorted supplies, and journals anxiously waiting to be filled with the triumphs and tribulations of the unknown. Their journey began like a snapshot out of a coming-of-age movie. On the first night, the group arrived at the sleepy mountain town of Silver Pine, greeted by glowing Christmas lights still strung across the main street and the comforting scent of pine and wood smoke. The group huddled for warmth in the only local diner, swapping banter with friendly waitstaff, and savoring a last hearty meal before venturing further into winter's embrace. Later that night, they squeezed into the tiny local theater, 10 friends laughing, stealing popcorn, and temporarily forgetting the magnitude of what lay ahead. For many, these small human moments of comfort and connection would become treasured memories long after the dangers of the wild took center stage. The next morning, still glowing from the previous night's joy, everyone took time to write letters home. Some dashed off quick lines of reassurance, others penned pages about dreams, fears, and the camaraderie of their unusual family. Michael, ever the group's communicator, even managed to find the local telegraph office and send an update to the Mountaineering Society back home. Everything was proceeding exactly on schedule. Spirits were high. Their equipment, attitudes, and friendships felt indestructible in the bright winter sun. Traveling deeper into the mountains on an old pickup truck, they sang along to half-remembered songs, traded rescue trivia, and took turns sharing stories of past misadventures. The world seemed impossibly large and inviting. The Rocky Mountains were the ultimate playground, and they were finally unleashed upon it. Even when the wind bit through their jackets or exhaustion threatened grumpiness, someone would crack a joke, share a forgotten snack, or produce an outlandish story that had the whole truck in stitches. First signs of danger. The spark of adventure always carries a secret warning. While hope runs high in the beginning, the wild has its own plans for those who dare test its boundaries. For John Carter's group, the first shadow of true danger crept in quietly, so quietly at first that it almost passed unnoticed. It was the morning of January 17th. The group, still buoyed by camaraderie and laughter, was bundled tightly in layers of synthetic and wool, the air hanging sharp and metallic with cold as they left behind the modest warmth of silver pine. Their hips and backs ached under the weight of overstuffed packs, but spirits remained determinedly sunny. The local driver, a weathered man named Hank, eyed the group with both amusement and caution as he dropped them on the edge of an old snow-packed logging road. "Storms run fast and mean up here," he warned, "and the pines sound different when they know something's coming." The words were brushed aside with a collective, polite nod. After all, how many times had they been warned by old-timers before every trip? And hadn't their months of planning prepared them for anything? The first unusual sign came after only a few hours, as they trekked across a wind-scraped ridge leading to Aspen Valley. Mark Johnson, usually the picture of endurance thanks to years as the Mountaineering Society's unofficial pack mule, started lagging behind. He struggled not with altitude as one might first suspect, but with stabbing pangs of pain running from his shoulder down to his hand. Sarah fell back to walk with him, quickly diagnosing nerve inflammation, possibly trigeminal neuralgia, a serious burden in the backcountry. They made a collective, somber decision. Mark would return with Hank to Silver Pine before the terrain, and his pain made retreat impossible, lightening his load and sending him off with reluctant hugs. The team felt their first pang of vulnerability, the realization that all the preparation in the world couldn't account for the randomness of the wild, or the fragility of even the strongest among them. With 9 left, the logistics shifted. With heavy hearts and strategic calculation, they stored surplus food and some technical equipment in a supply cache near Aspen Valley, marking its location under a twisted pine with surveyor's tape. They promised themselves to return for those supplies, optimistically, on their way down after a successful summit. John, ever the leader, tried to keep the mood light, telling tales of explorers who endured far worse setbacks and still returned triumphant. But each remaining member knew, deep down, that the margin for error had grown thinner. As the day pressed on, the wind shifted. Tendrils of mist curled low along the ridges, and a high, eerie whistling set the group's nerves ever so slightly on edge. Rebecca, careful and methodical, pushed for everyone to check radios and avalanche beacons twice before proceeding. Marcus snapped less photos, his poetic commentary giving way to silent, watchful observation. Even AJ could be seen quietly reinforcing the tent repair kit and checking zippers for cracks that might let in damp misery. By the time they made camp in the upper basin at dusk, fatigue weighed heavier than usual. The burned orange sky faded quickly into a bruised twilight, the kind where even the snow seemed to swallow all color and warmth. Chloe, the navigator, worried aloud about how fast the sun seemed to set, consulting their maps and GPS. Was this normal, or were shifting clouds heralding a storm much sooner than forecast? Despite thorough planning, unpredictability was asserting its dominance. Olivia made extra rounds through the camp, checking knotwork and tent stakes with hands that trembled, not from cold, but maybe from some premonition. That night, as the group tucked into their sleeping bags, the first howls of gale-force winds battered thin aluminum tent poles. The noise wasn't dangerous yet, but it felt almost sentient, a warning whispered only to those who knew how to listen. The hikers recounted the minor equipment failures that had plagued other expeditions, zippers freezing, stoves sputtering out, condensation turning the inside of tents into cold rain. They comforted each other with reassurances, some routine and others bordering on superstition, a lucky scarf, a lucky sandwich tucked away for the hardest day, even a joke about writing their names on their socks in case disaster struck. The night was long, the sleep broken, and a thin patina of unease settled over the camp. The next morning dawned sullen and gray, sky veiled in pewter clouds. The landscape, so inviting just days earlier, was now a quiet antagonist waiting to reveal its teeth. It's easy in the wild to let confidence morph into hubris. Even as Sarah checked their first aid supplies, John secretly recalculated supply estimates and reviewed evacuation contingencies in his mind. A simple accident or a single stroke of bad luck would now ripple much farther through the group's dynamic than before. By midday, the weather launched a new assault. Small, hard pellets of snow lashed their faces, and fog reduced visibility to the sharp arcs of their headlamps. Tyler, the philosopher, posed less about the meaning of danger and more about the distribution of weight in his backpack. Their humor grew a little grittier, the jokes tinged with an edge of underlying anxiety. No one wanted to say it aloud, but the adventure had slipped, almost imperceptibly, into something more ominous and real. Lost, amid the raging blizzard. The morning of January 21st dawned gray and ominous, the thin winter light barely seeping through the clouds that pressed close to Thunder Peak's eastern slopes. As they broke camp, an unfamiliar stillness settled on the world, the kind of silence that, in nature, always portends a reckoning. The night before, the wind had whispered worriedly through the trees, and a frost-like brittle glass had rimmed their tents. John Carter was the first to voice what everyone else was thinking. Feels like the mountain is holding its breath. Despite their growing unease, the group pressed onward. The route, meticulously charted on their topographical maps, should have taken them in a gentle zigzag below a talus field before winding up the eastern ridgeline. But visibility collapsed abruptly, as tendrils of wind-driven snow snaked along the ground, then exploded into a full whiteout by midday. It was as if the very landscape had vanished beneath a churning sea of ice and wind, the mountain erased, the horizons devoured, all sense of up or down lost to spinning flurries. At first, their confidence held. Rebecca, ever the practical one, organized everyone into a tight formation. Chloe, staring at the GPS until her eyes ached, reassured the others. "Stay together, keep moving, we'll break out of this squall soon enough." But her voice carried an edge of uncertainty she tried to hide. The blizzard worsened. With each hour the group's sense of direction eroded. Snow caked their eyebrows, every breath stung with icy needles. Voices became muffled. Even the brightest among them found it hard to think above the roar of the wind. They tried to follow their compass, but compasses spun, sometimes crazily. Magnetic anomalies in the area weren't uncommon, but never before had they seemed so insidious. Somewhere that afternoon, the world folded in on itself. Unbeknownst to the group, their careful trajectory had drifted southward, nowhere near the planned route to Thunder Peak's true ascent trail. Instead, they trudged into a hidden basin, a patch of wild, trackless woods gouged by steep slopes and tangled deadfall. Days later, searchers would debate whether this misstep was inevitable. On that day, for John and his friends, there was only the pressing need to survive hour by hour. Around 3 p.m., Sarah realized she could no longer make out the trees she'd been using as distant landmarks. "We need to set course by the wind," she urged, worry sharpening her tone, "or we're just walking in circles." But even that became impossible as the wind shifted constantly, north with a hint of east, then screaming back from the west, then calm for a cruel moment before slapping snow in their faces from another direction. Fatigue and anxiety bore down upon them. Marcus, the group's eternal optimist, tried to keep the spirits high with jokes and stories about past adventures, but the laughter quickly faded into the howl of the storm. John, fighting to stay level-headed, took frequent inventory checks. Each member's gloves, outerwear, and survival gear were scrutinized. Riots of snow tumbled over their boots with every step, and the slope beneath their feet alternated between deceptive gentleness and hidden icy ledges. Tyler questioned whether it might be smarter to backtrack rather than press blindly ahead, but John argued that stopping meant risking hypothermia, which the others quickly agreed was an unacceptable gamble. As the afternoon bled into an early dusk, visibility dropped to just a few feet. The sky, a flat, formless mass of gray, bled seamlessly into the land. Navigation was impossible. On several occasions, Alex and Chris scouted a few meters from the group, calling through shrieking gusts to make sure they hadn't crossed their own path or wandered back to camp without realizing. They marked the snow as best they could with ski poles and scraps of colored tape, but in minutes the marks were buried again. Any hopes of making the planned ridge crest evaporated. The exhaustion settled in like a second skin. Behind every breath was a silent panic. This isn't what was supposed to happen. Rebecca's voice, usually firm, quavered as she suggested finding emergency shelter somewhere off the main slope. But John and Sarah weighed the risks. Avalanche-prone terrain, the chance of being smothered by drifts if they chose wrong, the certainty of exposure if they set no camp at all. There was no easy answer. Finally, as the blizzard's banshee howls grew almost deafening, the group stumbled upon what looked like a slight recess in the slope, a brushy, wind-scoured ledge shielded by stunted conifers. It was not ideal, but, given the failing light and vanishing options, it would have to suffice. Here, amid the endless white, the group made the fateful decision. Rather than risk descending blindly into unknown forest in growing darkness, they would pitch their tents right there, exposed on the mountainside. The decision was not unanimous. Olivia quietly argued that shelter might be found in the timber below, but John, Sarah, Rebecca, and most of the others judged a hasty descent in the dark to be equally, if not more, dangerous. The cold had already begun to gnaw at their extremities. Moisture from their breath pooled as frost in their hoods. After a brief, tense debate, they set to work with desperate speed. The snow was packed and icy, resisting every attempt to drive in stakes or anchor the guy lines. Chloe's hands nearly froze as she fumbled with knots. AJ cursed loudly when one tent pole cracked and had to be hastily splinted with a trekking pole. Inside the thin nylon walls, the blizzard was muted but relentless. A constant chorus of rattling fabric, bruising gusts, and the eerie sense of being sealed off from the rest of the world. They ate a quick meal, canned ravioli heated over a sputtering stove. The meal tasted of fear more than anything else. Sleep came in snatches. Rebecca tried to soothe the others with whispered checklists for morning. Chloe clung to her navigation tablet as if it were a talisman, and Marcus stubbornly composed verses in his notebook to keep himself awake. Outside, the unrelenting storm piled snow ever higher against the tents, cocooning them but also threatening to bury the group alive if they weren't vigilant. Every hour, John or Sarah would force themselves out into the darkness to clear snow from the tent walls, counting heads before crawling, shivering back inside. Panic always hovered at bay, kept in check only by exhaustion and routine. Within, half-whispered conversations flitted between hope and dread. Would the storm pass by morning? Did they have enough fuel to melt snow for water if they had to wait out another day? What if no one ever found them? At the edges of drifting sleep, some thought they heard faint, impossible noises. A whistling not quite of wind, a low rumble beneath the snow, the echo of footsteps too heavy to be their own. In moments of lucidity, these were dismissed as tricks of the mind, brought on by nerves and isolation. Still, their vulnerability had never felt so absolute. The grandeur and romance of the Rockies, so intoxicating days before, had contracted into a single small patch of earth above the tree line, barely enough for 10 bodies to huddle together against the world. As dawn eked across the snowbound ridges, the blizzard at last subsided, leaving a fresh, alien landscape in its wake. Nothing looked familiar. The group's tents appeared half-buried and monstrous, wind-carved snowdrifts stretched in every direction, and where the ridgeline should have been was just an endless ripple of white. The group had survived the night, but their sense of control was as fractured as the icy ground beneath their feet. Now, truly lost, they would have to summon every scrap of resilience and ingenuity simply to keep hope alive. Mysterious disappearance, anticipation, and anxiety. As the weeks slipped by and the calendar bled from late January into mid-February, the sense of unease that had first crept into the University of Colorado's Mountaineering Society grew into something sharp and agonizing. At the onset, neither the university officials nor the families were especially alarmed when the group's prearranged check-in date passed without a word. After all, communications often faltered in the isolation of the Rockies. Radio batteries died, snowstorms disrupted phone signals, and delays in grueling winter ascents were almost to be expected. There was a natural tendency to be optimistic. Perhaps John's team was simply delayed by weather, waiting out a blizzard before descending safely. Parents clung to memories of their children's confidence, hearing their laughter echo in old voicemails and trusting in the rigorously detailed preparation the group had accomplished. But day after day, the silence deepened. The university's Mountaineering Society grew restless, fueled by group messages, huddled conversations, and repeated calls to the local ranger stations. Professors who had cheered for John Carter and his friends now paced their offices, haunted by worry. The club president, Michael Drury, found himself staring at the clock at all hours, each tick reminding him of the group's last report, dated weeks earlier, chipper and full of promise. Sarah Kim's mother, unable to sleep, began phoning hotels in mountain towns, sending hopeful emails to outdoor outfitters, anyone who might have seen a trace of the young climbers. For families, anxiety crept into every facet of daily life, boiling kettles left forgotten on stoves, text messages that blinked unread, nightmares from which it was hard to wake. The Mountaineering Society convened an emergency meeting. Every available member pored over weather data, charts showing winter storm cycles, satellite images riddled with bands of ice blue, and obsessed over the expedition's itinerary, maps annotated in red ink with possible shelter points, alternate routes, and escape trails. The sense of shared purpose quickly shifted from anticipation to gnawing dread. Professors quietly contacted local law enforcement. Eventually, the university's administration reached out to the National Park Service, asking if anyone had spotted the telltale red and blue tents or heard from the group's satellite phone, silent for days, its last ping lost somewhere in the shadow of Thunder Peak. By mid-February, the informal search transformed into an urgent, coordinated rescue effort. The Mountaineering Society, refusing to wait passively, organized search parties comprised of seasoned student climbers, faculty volunteers, and local hikers who knew the Rockies' secrets. Posters appeared in every outpost and lodge, each one bearing grainy photos of beaming young faces. Helicopter crews took to the skies, fighting punishing winds and whiteout conditions, scanning wide swaths of rugged backcountry for even the faintest clue. A glimmer of fabric in the snow, tracks leading away from a forested hollow, or a lone backpack half buried by drifts. Rescue dogs barked and pawed at patches of frozen earth, their noses pressed to the ice. For the families, time became a strange antagonist, each day stretching and coiling with hope and heartache. Mornings were filled with tense phone calls and frantic checks of the news, afternoons passed in waiting rooms and impromptu prayer circles. Members of the Mountaineering Society traded rumors and theories. Had John's team hunkered down to wait out another blizzard, or had something worse happened? Newscasters started picking up the story. Search intensifies for missing college climbers, headlines blared, and across the country families watched television coverage that barely seemed real. Sarah's younger sister, who'd envied her siblings' courage, now spent hours scrolling through social media, clinging to messages of support and pictures from better days. The Carter family, sleepless and raw, drove out to Colorado, joining the gathering cluster of families at base camp, there with supplies, photos, and a desperate hope to join the effort if allowed. Candlelight vigils flickered through dormitories while professors distributed flyers and coordinated press conferences, appealing for volunteers and expert advice. The entire university seemed suspended in uncertainty, united by sorrow and hope, unwilling to relinquish faith in their friends. As search efforts ramped up, the logistics proved daunting. Nightly temperatures dropped well below zero, battering rescue teams' stamina and testing their gear against the ceaseless cold. Choppers circled for hours, fighting turbulence and unpredictable mountain drafts, but snowdrifts sometimes swallowed all evidence by morning. Park rangers cautioned that new storms would soon make trails impassable, but the searchers pressed on, driven by loyalty and sheer stubbornness. Local news stations cycled through interviews with concerned parents and old friends, while speculation rippled across internet forums and cafes, from the pragmatic, perhaps a radio failed or the group took shelter in a cave, to the fantastical, whispered hints of secret government experiments or strange natural phenomena in the Rockies. As days dragged on, a heavy malaise cloaked the search parties. More than one member of the Mountaineering Society refused to go home, camping out in rented vans and pine-scented cabins, determined to comb every valley and ridge by foot. Some rescue workers battled frustration and guilt, convinced each hour's delay meant the difference between rescue and recovery. Each delay became agony, a false sighting, a set of old tracks that led nowhere, a colorful scarf that ultimately belonged to another unrelated hiker. The sling between hope and despair frayed at the edges, threatening to snap. Yet even as exhaustion and helplessness threatened to overtake them, the community did not give in. Stories circulated of John's legendary resilience, Sarah's level-headedness, and Becky's ingenuity, reminders that if anyone could endure the Rockies' worst, it was this group. Late-night strategy sessions endured, with satellite maps spread across cafeteria tables illuminated by the flickering glow of laptop screens. The university's phone lines buzzed round the clock, and the National Park headquarters echoed with radio transmissions deep into the night. No one wanted to speak the unthinkable. For every setback, someone would recall a miracle survival story from years before, stoking faith among volunteers and kin alike, until the next dawn brought only more questions and silence. Every personal item took on new significance. The smallest detail, a favorite mug found at the last trailhead, an abandoned snow shovel, became a clue. Parents clung to these tokens, believing that anything could point the way to their children. In living rooms and rescue tents, television cycled through amateur meteorologist segments or rehashed details of the expedition's preparation, each detail scrutinized for a sign or pattern, what was missed, what had changed, what the mountains themselves were hiding. For many, the waiting was worse than any finality could have been. The absence of answers gnawed ceaselessly. Were the students out there, hungry and cold? Had they been swept away by an avalanche, or were they huddled together, determined to survive, waiting for rescue? In the stillness of midnight, some imagined the group telling stories to keep spirits high, drawing warmth from memories, waiting for the crunch of approaching boots. There were moments when the community's spirit seemed on the verge of breaking, only to steady itself in acts of solidarity. A meal delivered to a worried parent, a blanket left in the searcher's van, a group text from a classmate promising that no one would rest until answers were found. In the strange, painful limbo of waiting, the search became as much about holding together as about finding the missing. The Rockies, timeless and unmoved, stood silent as hundreds cast their hopes against the cold wind, all praying for one clear sign amidst the endless, snowbound uncertainty. Detecting a shock on the cold mountain slope. The date was February 24th, a date that would be etched into the collective memory of the university, the families, and the entire nation. I can still see the image in my mind. The sun struggling to break through leaden clouds, rescue teams inching up the battered, wind-scoured slopes with a determined sort of exhaustion. Each step was deliberate, every movement cautious, as if the ice beneath their feet might betray them at any moment. Nearly a month had passed since the last faint signal from John's group, enough time for both hope and rationality to become threadbare from where. On that morning, the lead rescue team moved into an area that recent storms had rendered almost unrecognizable. At the tree line just below Thunder Peak, search dogs yelped at a cluster of snowdrifts, scratching frantically. A flicker of red and blue fabric poked out from the snow, nearly invisible beneath feet of drift. At first, most assumed it was just abandoned gear, a lost tarp. Many false alarms had occurred already. But as the snow was carefully cleared away, hands numb and breath-forming clouds in the frigid air, the enormity of what they'd found sunk in. A tent, torn open at the top, sides half collapsed, was revealed. The rescue team exchanged looks of disbelief and dread. The tent was a chilling tableau. The cut ran clean through the tent wall, later determined by investigators to have been made from the inside, as if its occupants had been compelled to flee in absolute panic or desperation. Every piece of gear, their boots lined neatly, half-eaten food rations, journals with entries from the previous day, spoke to a sudden, jarring interruption. Not a single human figure remained. Worse still, there was no trail of chaos, no signs of an attack, no struggle that might explain the evacuation. Instead, 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent in a single wavering line, heading downslope toward the twisted forms of sparse, wind-battered pines. The detailed snowprints showed frenzied disorganization. Some staggered, some slightly deeper as if weighed down, and even more unsettling. Several were barefoot or in only partial socks, despite the lethal cold. The team's radios crackled as news spread instantly down the line and across the mountain. More teams converged on the scene. The tragic scope was impossible to ignore. I imagine how rescue members' hands must have shaken not from cold, but the sickening realization that the worst fears were being confirmed, one discovery at a time. Following the footprints, each step a testament in snow to the chaos and terror of that unknown night, the rescue party found a stand of pine trees nearly a mile and a half down the slope. 2 bodies, huddled in only their thin underclothes, lay at the base of the largest tree, near a small circle of scorched earth from a failed campfire. Charred branches and blackened snow suggested a desperate attempt at warmth. Their skin bore marks of frostbite, and faces seemed frozen in startled expressions, as if even death brought no relief from whatever terror had driven them from the tent. Around them, scattered remnants told fragmentary stories, torn strips of clothing, half-burned logs, and a single mitten that did not match either victim. The search party, grim and methodical, fanned out along the route leading back toward the tent. Over the course of several hours, more bodies were discovered, some partially buried by snow, others lying in shallow depressions in the ice. Each case was different. Some seemed to have died of exposure, huddled and clutching one another for heat, while others bore ghastly injuries. One had broken ribs, another extensive facial trauma, and several had bruising on their arms and legs as if they'd suffered violent, inexplicable accidents. Investigators later pieced together that, judging by the way the clothing had been distributed and torn, The group had shared and traded garments in the final hours. Those who died first had been stripped to provide the living a better chance against the bitter night. It was a chilling testament to friendship and survival instincts colliding in a crucible of unimaginable stress. Perhaps most confounding to rescuers and experts alike was the order and placement of the bodies. Why had they split up? Why had some ascended back toward the tent only to collapse barely halfway? And what could have prompted a group of experienced mountaineers to abandon a fortified position in winter, carrying so little, and head into a gale with almost certain death waiting on the other side? The absence of blood, animal tracks, or any sign of outside struggle only deepened the mystery. Photographs taken of the site would haunt not only families but the public imagination for years. News stations later replayed the blurred, somber faces of the search party, EMTs standing over shrouded forms, and officials shaking their heads in bewilderment over and over. Some rescuers, hardened by years of alpine work, admitted privately that the sense of unease never quite left them, the inexplicable chill that this tragedy was somehow out of sync with any simple explanation. The forensic investigation stretched for months afterward. Meticulous cataloging of every scrap of clothing and gear, autopsies conducted in sterile labs far from the wild, psychological and environmental experts offering competing theories on what might drive an entire group to such an end. The cut in the tent, the bare feet in the snow, the pattern of injuries, each detail fueled speculation, rumors, and haunted dreams. Some officials returned to the mountain many more times, haunted by the hope they had missed a clue, an answer that would make sense of the shock that rippled outward from Thunder Peak. For the families, the discovery was the cruel closure that brought no real comfort. Funeral processions, memorials at the university, and quiet gatherings in the homes of loved ones provided space for grief, but never understanding. The mountain and its stubborn silence held its own counsel, and for the rescue teams and investigators, every detail from the precise angle of the tent tear to the oddities of the footprints was committed to memory, replayed relentlessly in the search for a solution. In the aftermath of that day, Thunder Peak's slopes became both a grave and a riddle, drawing not only searchers and mourners but also adventurers, conspiracy theorists, and journalists, all seeking to unravel what had really taken place on that frozen, wind-lashed mountainside so many weeks before. A journey. Tracing the footsteps and chilling discoveries. The harsh, colorless expanse of the Rocky Mountains in late winter became an uneasy stage for a relentless series of grim discoveries as investigators undertook the daunting journey of following the group's fading tracks. In the beginning, the rescue teams were propelled by desperate hope, but reality soon shifted their task to one of grim, clinical documentation. Every searcher was aware that any clue, no matter how small, could change the narrative entirely. As they pressed forward, the snow muffled all sounds but their own strained breathing, and the ever-present crunch of ice and frost beneath heavy boots. The team began by meticulously plotting the trail away from the half-collapsed tent. The line of footprints, some erratic and barely distinguishable, others pressed deep into the snow, pulled them gnarled and winding down the slope, as if they could still feel the panic and confusion of that night. In some places the prints doubled back or scattered painfully as if someone had stumbled or hesitated, unwilling to go further. The clues grew increasingly personal. A battered woolen glove wedged under a snowdrift, loose threads from a torn parka, even scraps of paper with hurried words scrawled in pencil, notes of farewell or desperate orientation scribbled in the darkness. For nearly half a mile the tracks painted a tortured story. The wind had erased parts of their journey, leaving gaps where the minds of searchers could only imagine what had occurred. Moments of indecision, those who collapsed and were half carried by friends, and times when the only compass was panic itself. As the search party advanced, the snow took on a narrative of its own. Flattened patches where several had huddled for warmth, faint markings suggesting that a member attempted to crawl rather than walk, as their strength failed them in the biting cold. The first major discovery lay within a small grove of battered pines, their trunks gnawed raw by the ceaseless wind. Here, in a pocket where the wind had less power, the rescuers found the scorched remains of a campfire, small, pitiful and blackened against the unending white. Two bodies huddled close together at its edge, clad in little more than undergarments and torn fragments of outerwear. Their frozen faces held haunted expressions, eyes open, hands contorted in the universal hope of warding off the cold. The presence of burned branches, quarters of logs, and strips of torn clothing scattered around painted a picture of desperate, fleeting attempts at survival. Not far from the improvised fire, rescuers discovered more chilling details, a trail of torn fabric leading into a shallow hollow in the snow, as if guiding toward what little shelter the landscape offered. There, another body was found partially buried by a recent drift. Unlike the others, this victim still clung to a tattered jacket, fingers frozen rigid around the collar. Evidence suggested a struggle against the elements. Scratch marks in the snow, rotated rocks and twigs as if walls had been hastily built for shelter. Moving gradually back toward the original tent, the searchers found other victims spaced in eerie intervals. Some appeared to have died huddling together, their arms around each other's shoulders, instinctively sharing the last vestiges of body heat. Others lay at odd angles alone, as though overtaken by the cold, while exhausting their last reserves of strength to crawl toward safety. The clothing situation was as distressing as it was puzzling. In many cases, layers had clearly been stripped from those who succumbed first and handed over to others still alive, evidence of both harrowing compassion and sheer will to survive. Strips of fabric and gear had been repurposed as makeshift wrappings for feet and hands, testifying to the group's desperate improvisation. The physical evidence grew more unsettling the deeper teams went. Several victims bore inexplicable injuries for their context, severe bruising on their arms or legs as though they had fallen or tumbled from a height, and a few with broken ribs or even skull fractures with no sign of external violence or attack. One had blood-stained snow beneath his body, yet no wound that could account for such bleeding, a detail that mystified forensic experts and would later fuel decades of speculation. In one place a single mitten was found, far from the closest body, its fabric torn as though ripped away mid-struggle or as part of an urgent attempt to transfer warmth. Personal items were scattered among the wreckage, a cracked camera smeared with snow, rolls of half-developed film, a water bottle still half full but frozen solid, and a small notebook containing the last written words of a trembling hand. Within its pages, fragments of sentences revealed mounting distress. Too cold. Lost. Snow too deep. Help. The fear in those words was as unmistakable as the finality of their placement among the drifts. One of the most disturbing finds awaited near a rock outcrop, half a mile from the first cluster of bodies. Here, tucked into the crevice, rescuers found two more members, pressed close together as if sheltering from the relentless wind. The features of both were marked by deep confusion and pain, one with significant facial trauma, the other missing portions of soft tissue from the cheeks and lips, likely the work of scavenging animals after death, but haunting nonetheless. Around their resting place, branches had been broken or bent at odd angles, perhaps used as makeshift barricades or for struggling against the snow. Expert searchers mapped every clue, where boots had slipped, where desperate hands had tried to dig into the snow, and where knee prints hinted at collapse. The meticulous cataloging of these minute details amplified a sense of collective unease. This was no straightforward accident. Each sign reflected a frantic ballet between fear, survival, and surrender. The path from the tent, the night of terror, and the scattered remains stitched a somber tapestry of the last hours these young climbers endured. A story far stranger and more tragic than anyone wanted to believe. Hypotheses, debates, and the endless investigation. As the chilling details of the Thunder Peak tragedy filtered out of the Rockies and into the national consciousness, a tidal wave of theories, debates, and mounting controversy took hold in both the public and professional spheres. Official investigations, independent experts, and armchair sleuths alike pored over every scrap of evidence. Photos of the tent, the configuration of bodies, the peculiar injuries, the distribution of clothing, and the weather patterns on those fateful days. What had truly happened to the group of young and experienced mountaineers who seemed so prepared, so determined, and so hopeful just weeks earlier? At first, the most obvious hypothesis was a classic one: avalanche. The steep, wind-loaded slopes above the campsite, the hasty exit through the tent wall, the chaos and desperation of the footprints, these suggested that the group had believed their lives were in immediate peril from a mass of snow about to descend. Avalanche experts, however, weren't so easily convinced. The position of the tent, partially standing and not buried, the shallow depth of snow at the site, and the peculiar lack of certain typical avalanche signatures all cast doubt. As one seasoned Rocky Mountain rescue analyst noted, "The basics add up until you look at the fine print, then the mystery just deepens." If not avalanche, then what? Some investigators focused on the evidence that suggested an acute internal threat, some kind of panic or conflict within the group that caused them to act irrationally. Forensic psychologists pored over the journals found in the tent and campfire remains, searching for signs of discord, breakdowns in leadership, or psychosis triggered by the extreme environment. Yet no diary entries, messages home, or recorded observations indicated anything but a remarkably cohesive group supporting one another against the elements. Another school of thought zeroed in on environmental or physiological hazards. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning camp stove could have caused disorientation and paranoia, perhaps explaining the panicked exit and some of the seemingly irrational behavior. However, forensic scientists found little evidence of stove malfunctions, and the crisp, clean mountain air made the scenario less likely. Hallucinogenic exposure was briefly considered, a rare mold, a toxin leaching from gear or food, but testing turned up nothing conclusive. Some experts looked to hypothermia itself for answers. Paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermia victims remove clothes as their nerve signals misfire, could account for the barely clad bodies found by the campfire, and the redistribution of clothing supported the hypothesis that the group was desperately trying to share warmth. However, it failed to account for the violent injuries suffered by several members, fractures more consistent with a severe fall or blunt force than with exposure alone. The injuries, in fact, became the central sticking point for the avalanche theory and all its alternatives. 3 of the deceased bore massive chest or skull trauma, damage described in some reports as comparable to a high-speed car crash, but there was no evidence of falling debris, nor did the layout of the bodies or damage to the tent indicate that the site had been overrun by a massive, fast-moving force. The medical examiner's reports were as clinical as they were haunting: trauma without external visual wounds, internal injuries without clear external cause, always in the context of a cold, empty mountainside with no witnesses. Wildlife attack? Not a chance, insisted local biologists and trackers. There were no bite marks, no evidence of scavenging beyond post-mortem exposure, no signs of struggle, no blood, no dragging. Some even suggested the possibility of a fight between the climbers themselves, but here again, testimony from family, friends, and psychological analyses argued against it. This was a group known for harmony, discipline, and solidarity. As the months wore on, more outlandish theories took flight. There were whispers of government experiments, secret military testing in the remote ranges, perhaps sonic weapons or classified atmospheric research gone awry. Old-timers in nearby towns swapped stories of strange lights and unexplained rumblings on the night of the disaster. Amateur sleuths scoured declassified documents and weather anomalies, using internet forums to propose everything from missile testing to UFO encounters. One popular conspiracy claimed that the area around Thunder Peak was home to secret laboratories and that the climbers had stumbled into a forbidden zone, prompting a cover-up. Yet, as always, solid evidence was nowhere to be found. Other theories, less sensational but grounded in the unpredictability of the Rockies, pointed to freak weather phenomena. Experts dissected satellite data, suggesting a rare, sudden temperature inversion or the formation of katabatic winds, which could have produced hurricane-force gusts, capable of flattening tents and disorienting even the most skilled mountaineers. Some posited that infrasound vibrations, a product of wind flowing in certain topographies, could trigger panic, hallucinations, or an irresistible urge to flee. These explanations, while compelling, struggled to account fully for all the group's actions and especially the dire injuries. With each year that passed, the official story, an avalanche or snow slab collapse forcing the group from their tent, followed by a series of fatal, desperate attempts at survival, remained largely unchanged, if always freighted with a footnote of uncertainty. Independent documentaries, in-depth podcasts, and long-form articles kept the debate alive. Investigative journalists stalked government archives and battered microfiche at university libraries. Theories were drawn and redrawn, each trying to account for the chilling mosaic left on Thunder Peak. Families and survivors, meanwhile, found themselves caught between the bureaucratic closure of the official investigation and the relentless hope that new details might emerge. Some sought solace in the mountains themselves, returning to the site with investigator teams, geologists, and spiritual advisors. Others lobbied for the release of classified search and rescue dispatches, convinced that answers lurked in redacted lines or unreleased photographs. The Mountaineering Society of the university held an annual symposium inviting experts in alpine trauma, disaster psychology, and even fringe researchers. None could close the wound, but each brought new wisdom to an ever-expanding tapestry of study. As of today, the Thunder Peak incident remains a tangle of hard evidence and unanswered questions. Each generation of mountaineers revisits the case. New climbers stare at the snowy ridge and wonder what unseen forces haunt that desolate slope. For some, it is a cautionary tale of nature's fury and human error. For others, it's a riddle that will never be put to rest, a testimony to our need to seek meaning, even in the face of inconceivable tragedy. The tragedy's legacy endures, a warning, a mystery, and a point of reverence for all who venture into the white silence of the high Rockies, always asking, what really happened to John Carter's team that night beneath the mountain's implacable gaze? Endless questions and the legacy that remains. Decades have slipped by, yet the snowbound mystery of Thunder Peak still casts a shadow both long and cold across the heart of the Rocky Mountains. For the families and friends of the lost climbers, time itself has become a confusing paradox, an endless procession of days marked less by healing and more by the cyclical return of unanswered questions. For investigators, outdoor enthusiasts, and the wider public, the tragedy has evolved past the boundaries of a mere accident. It now stands as a symbol for the unsettling, sometimes overwhelming ambiguity of the natural world. Every year, as winter deepens its grip on the high country, the story resurfaces, on television documentaries, in university lecture halls, around campfires, and in forums where amateur sleuths still swap wild theories. Thunder Peak has become not just a destination, but a pilgrimage. High atop the windswept ridge, ribbons of weathered fabric mark a makeshift memorial. Colorful scarves, handwritten notes, candles, and occasional trinkets left behind by strangers who feel the weight of collective grief. It's here that survivors, those who knew the climbers best, sometimes return on anniversaries, guided by a need that words can't quite express. Some come in silence, laying flowers or touching the battered bark of the pine trees where their friends' last struggles unfolded. Others stand, wrapped against the wind, recalling shared memories, warmth by a campfire, laughter echoing off snowy rock faces, dreams whispered beneath starlit skies. There is comfort in remembrance, but never closure. The mountains keep secrets better than any person ever could. Among mountaineers and search and rescue professionals, the case has left a different legacy, a culture of even greater vigilance and humility. Thunder Peak is now a cautionary tale cited in guidebooks, mandatory training sessions, and lectures for novice climbers. There is a growing respect for nature's unpredictability, for the necessity of rigorous preparation, and for the limits of human understanding in the face of wilderness. Emergency procedures have been revised, technologies improved, and countless expeditions have adopted new protocols inspired directly by the lessons, sometimes tragic, taught by this lost team. The investigation files still occupy a file cabinet's worth of space at Ranger headquarters, with maps and autopsy reports yellowing with age. Each new generation of law enforcement, scientists, or journalists who opens the dusty folders brings fresh eyes, new tools, and a hope that some overlooked clue will finally illuminate the elusive truth. Yet with each passing year, the hard edges of the facts begin to blur, overtaken by myth and collective memory. Elders in the climbing community now share stories of the Thunder Peak expedition like modern folklore, mixing fact and speculative fiction in a tradition as old as storytelling itself. The legend has also found a home in art and literature. Poets have written mournful verses inspired by the lost climbers' struggle, while artists try to capture the scale and isolation of their last days through paint and canvas. In classrooms, the event is often discussed not just as a safety lesson, but as a meditation on the power of the unknown, the idea that sometimes the greatest wilderness is found not in the landscape, but in the human need for answers where there may be none. Most poignant of all are the ripples that move outward, touching the families left behind. Parents and siblings have formed an enduring, if bittersweet, community, advocating for better search resources, building scholarships in their loved ones' names, and lighting candles every winter. Their grief, though deeply personal, has knit together a network of support for others navigating similar tragedies. The television specials come and go and the headlines fade, but the questions remain. Why did an impeccably prepared group abandon their shelter in the dead of night? What force or fear could drive seasoned mountaineers into the frozen dark with so little to protect themselves? Was it merely the whim of nature, or something stranger, some echo of forces science cannot yet understand? No annual memorial goes by without someone raising these questions anew, their voice blending with the mountain wind, Maybe that is the final legacy, an aching, persistent need to understand, to bring meaning to the disorder left behind by disaster. Thunder Peak's shadow stretches not only across miles of snow and pine but across the imagination of a nation unwilling to let go. Is there solace in the mystery? Perhaps only in accepting that for all our expertise, our tools, and our courage, the wild retains its own sovereignty, a sovereignty paid for sometimes with life and always with awe. The unknown does not always yield its secrets, and the cold, haunted slopes of Thunder Peak remind us, year after year, that even when closure eludes us, memory and meaning are ours to build and to share.